Thank you for the introduction, Rasmus, and thank you for coming this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, and also that we can make this collaboration with the Danish Institute with the research project, that we could be speaking both. So I'm the fourth. We have had my colleague Amalie Skovmøller and Ida Haugaard, and also Sámi Truelsen before. Today I will be speaking about sculpture in the 18th century in Denmark and in Norway. And in one way it is maybe the biggest contrast from some of the sculptural traditions that is outside us here in Athens, which makes it in a way interesting because a lot of these sculptures are made in direct contradistinction to the 18th century antique models of sculpture that was really kind of developed in Denmark at that time, in the 18th century with the neoclassicist period, where the interest in antique Greek sculpture was intense. The sculptures I will be speaking about were seen as kind of horrible at the time because the ideal was so oriented towards what was historically seen upon as antique sculpture. And I will try to introduce this project called Nordmandsdalen, and it is a kind of a word that is difficult to translate, but it could be say it's the Valley of the Norsemen, Valley of the Norwegian. I'll come back to it. And here we see the sculpture park that I will be taking its starting point in. And as you can see here, this is a park comprised of 70 life-size sculptures of Norwegian, Sámi, and Faroese workers, laborers. And it's made between 1764 and 1784. And I don't think we really have any similar sculpture projects, at least not in Northern Europe, that at this early time show workers, everyday people, fishermen, agricultural workers, lumberjacks, and women. And in art history, there has not been a lot written about it. But still, a couple of years ago, in the Norwegian cultural newspaper Morgenbladet, an essay came just before Christmas that dealt with this park. And it introduced this park to audience who don't know it in this way. Under the title, The Most Norwegian Place in the World, and No One Visits It, the journalist, or the historian, Trygve Riiser Gunnarsson, who is an 18th century specialist, wrote the following. There is a garden on the other side of the sea. It is the most Norwegian place in the world. No one goes there anymore. Everyone has forgotten it. It exists. The garden lies in a park near a lake by a large white palace. From the palace, paths shoot out, radiating through the greenery, just as the sun breaks through the clouds, just as royal power stretches across the kingdom, just as reason penetrates the world. In this quite poetic prose, the historian introduces kind of a Columbusing act of finding a park that everyone had forgotten existed, and that he was the first one who had found and seen since the 18th century, the most Norwegian place in the world. The park is Fredensborg. Fredensborg lies about 45 minutes north of Copenhagen in Denmark. The palace you see here is also where the queen and the now king resides in the spring and the fall. So of course, if you know that the Danish royalty still lives in this park, one might not think so much of this as a place nobody has visited for 300 years. But the specific sculpture park, the Valley of the Norsemen, is placed a bit to the kind of on the side of this huge Baroque park that was established in the early 18th century, approximately in the woods where I tried to put a little red arrow. And it is indeed a very special park. It is a park that we really don't have any similar examples of. It's a kind of amphitheater comprised with a column in the middle, a victory column representing the king, Frederik V, and around in 3 layers, all these men and women stand there oriented towards this column, bringing different goods to the table in a big celebration of the king. And I'll come back to that in a second. But the fact that this historian said that nobody had visited this park was immediately kind of funny, because this park that you see, the sculptures that you see here, are not 250, 70 years old. They are actually 20 years old, because the Danish Arts Council have recarved all the 70 sculptures just a couple of decades ago, because this is one of the Queen's favorite places in the park. This is where the Queen goes with her friends. So the Apemølla Foundation gave 26 million Danish kroner to recarve all these statues. So this park has definitely been visited by people. This is actually a quite new replacement of the original one. So I had to write a little respond to the Norwegian historian and say this might be a bit kind of ungenerous to say that nobody had visited this park beside you, given the fact that there has been an enormous amount of labor to make this park appear as if it has been, that it exists today and that you could visit it still. And these stories of how sculpture from the past is kind of rediscovered or reframed time and time again is one of the topics of the exhibition that is now up at Art Museum, Kode Art Museum in Bergen in Norway, called Nordmandsdalen, Art, Power and Materials in the 18th century Denmark-Norway. And tonight I will try to kind of take you through that exhibition as a way to talk about the role and function of sculpture in the 18th century, but also how sculpture and this particular project has taken an enormous amount of versions and meanings from the 18th century up until today. And one of the interesting points to me in this project is both that it tells us something about the role of art in the 18th century, but also that it says something about the fact that monumental sculpture, what we now maybe see as public sculpture, the meaning changes over time. They tend to move around, even though they are large and heavy. Each of these statues in the park weigh around 800 kilos, so they are quite heavy. Still, they travel all over the place. They move, they shift meanings, and they are entering into new kind of entanglements with different kinds of histories. And that's some of the things that we wanted to address in this exhibition, to both talk about the shifting meaning of sculpture, but also to talk about the histories that you find when you start looking at the materials that art is made through. And I'll come back to that in a second. And as also Rasmus said, this is part of the exhibition, and my research is part of this project called Moving Monuments. And specifically the Nordmandsdalen project is a collaboration with another research project, the TO2 project, How Norway Made the World Whiter, a project about the mining of the specific white powder south of Bergen that is in everything you see around you, in your toothpaste and in your paint, that has had an enormous influence on how the world looks. This is a project that deals with materials and the political and historical and ecological function of materials. So I've collaborated with two art historians from that project, Helene Birkeli and Tonje Haugland Sørensen. We pitched this exhibition to Kode, and at the Art Museum, this exhibition has also been co-curated by two of their curators, Morten Spjøtvold and Peder Valle. But let's get to the park, let's get back to history, so to speak. I'm kind of using the exhibition as a bit of a framework, because you can kind of, maybe you don't have the opportunity to go to Bergen until January 2nd. And it is one way to tell a complex story. So the first thing you will meet in the exhibition is the statue standing outside, or just by the entrance. It's one of the statues of a lumberjack from Nordmandsdalen, but it's not from the 1760s, it's from 2018. And it's one of the many iterations of this sculpture that the sculpture keeps, is, often a reproductive medium. We maybe think sculpture as something unique and original, but sculpture has this long history of course, being reproduced endlessly, as you can see in all the souvenir stores on the way over here, where you can buy reproductions of famous sculptures. And we call them the starting point homecoming, because in 1989, several sculptures from Nordmandsdalen was lauded to be coming home to Norway. In 1989, the then crown princess of Norway, now Queen Sonja, inaugurated the first set of sculptures that were taken so-called back from Denmark, that was set up in Norwegian municipalities all around the country. This was the fact that due to the recarving of all the sculptures, Norwegian municipalities heard that there were these unique sculptures that depicted normal people from the regions in Norway. And all these municipalities thought, this is amazing. We can finally see how people from our region looked in the 18th century, like a window to the past. So they ordered recarved versions. And the first two, a fisherman with a lobster fisherman was set up in Karmøy, a bit close to Bergen, in 1898. And the Danish queen allowed these sculptures of hers in her garden to be reproduced. This was only the first of a number of these reproductions. This is how they are standing today. This is from Google Street View, so their faces are blurred. These are, though, not the ones that were put up in 1989 that were made in sandstones. These are concrete versions because in 2002, during the winter, a car drove, or like a car that was going to clean the snow, drove into the sculptures and smashed them, so they had to make new versions. But they are now part of the kind of a tourist magnet in the city. And here in this text, it said, "He is dearly welcomed back." That was the kind of version with the sculpture of the lobster fisherman. And one of the things when I read these texts is like, but what is actually welcomed back? This is a sculpture in sandstone, a recarved version, that had actually never been in Norway before. It was made by Grund, a Danish-German sculptor in Copenhagen in the 1760s, and had never been to Bergen before. But yet, this idea and investment in these sculptures representing real Norwegians, due to also the notion of Nordmandsdalen, the valley of the Norsemen, made this a point of identification across time. In Nes and Hallingdal, 5 sculptures were put up in 1990. There are many examples of this. The most recent is a memorial for sailors lost at sea, put up in northern Norway in 2018, using new versions of Nordmandsdal sculptures from that region, of the fisherman and his wife. So Nordmandsdal is still being produced and is put to use in all these different capacities, from tourist magnets or tourist kind of windows to the past, to here like as a memorial for fishermen. The sculpture that we start our exhibition with, this lumberjack, was produced because it was supposed to go to Hitra to be part of this memorial. But the 18th century names for the cities are easy to mix, so the Danish Arts Council, they made a version of the wrong sculpture. So they copied a lumberjack, and when it was going to be sent to northern Norway to be part of this fisherman at sea memorial, they realized that this is not the sculpture we want, this is not from our local constituency, so they had to make new ones. So the lumberjack is now standing outside in Copenhagen, giving us the ability to loan it. So we wanted to start the exhibition by pointing out the fact that even though we were talking about 18th century, our way of approaching history always engages with questions of reinterpretations. And Nordmandsdal is a project that people have been invested radically different stories in for about 300 years. But our exhibition actually is a certain homecoming of sorts, or at least this is one of the first time these 18th century sculptures actually did come to Bergen. We were allowed to loan some of the original sandstone sculptures. They couldn't enter the exhibition in itself because they weigh 800 kilos. That would mean that they would be in the fall through the floor into the restaurant below. So they stand outside. But we were grateful in order to get some of these sculptures to Norway. One of the things that we also wanted with this, or that had been my interest for a long time, of dealing with 18th century, is that it's a point in time in art history, both in Denmark and Norway, that has been quite overlooked. Since Denmark and Norway used to be one country until 1814, the 18th century, from a Norwegian perspective, is not something you talk about. This is one of the first Norwegian art historians who wrote in a text about the 400 years night that has become a fixed expression from Norway's life during the centuries that pass, between the sunset of Håkon and Olaf and the dawn of the Eidsvoll day. between 1400 and 1800. So the narrative in Norwegian art history is that when Norway became together with Denmark in a union, or as some Norwegians say, in a power dynamic of a kind of a colonial sense, nothing happened in Norway. It was a 400-year night where Norway slept. So in the Norwegian art history book, you will see that there is a lot about the Viking Age and the Middle Age, and then there is like 3-4 pages about 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, and then when Norwegian national identity is created in the 19th century, that's when everything happens. So the 18th century is a period that is really written and researched very little in Norwegian art history. And in Danish art history, everything that relates to Norway is not relevant, because when those countries split apart, that wasn't our responsibility anymore. So the ways how modern nation states reorganize the past and which histories become relevant or not is also something we wanted to address. And this also deals with the city of Bergen. So the exhibition is in Bergen, and Bergen used to be the most important city in Norway for many, many years. And specifically the 18th century, the city of Bergen, which for those of you who don't know where it is, it's on the west coast of Norway, was actually one of the most important harbor and port cities. It was a colonial hub for where Denmark-Norway controlled both the colony in the north, the Sámi indigenous territories. Everything went through Bergen, and it was also from Bergen that the colonization of Kalaallit or Greenland happened in the early 18th century. It was Norwegian merchants that controlled that colony. And it was also in Bergen where a lot of the ships from the Danish West Indies, the Caribbean colony with sugar, entered Norway through. So we have sugar refineries in Bergen. Bergen was really a trade port. And this is something that we don't talk a lot about in Norway, because now the capital is in Oslo, on the other side of the country, and that's usually where art history is written from. So in the exhibition we wanted to address kind of focus on Bergen, because the whole history of why there is a sculpture park with 70 workers in Denmark outside the castle of the king and queen, everything comes back to the city of Bergen. Due to this man. We don't have a picture of Jørgen Garnaas, but in 1750, a young man came from Midlands in Norway and moved to Bergen and took up the role as a post rider. And a post rider was a guy who literally went around with post from the city all around to the neighbor parishes. And Jørgen Garnaas was not only a post rider, he also was a wood carver. So on his travels, he carved small statues in wood. And those statues often depicted people that he met along his way. So, and in our exhibition, we managed to trace this big sculpture project back to this one worker in Norway, a post rider. And this is the guy we only know anything about because he had contact with the king, and the archival traces left us there. We don't have a self-portrait of him, but we did during the research find this small image that he made in ivory of a post rider. We couldn't get it into the exhibition because we found it too late. But I think this is a depiction that at least he made in the 1750s of a post rider. So one can imagine that this is a bit how at least he envisioned himself as a man who travels around with post. And Jørgen Garnaas then worked in the area of Bergen. This is a map from the 18th century of Bergen. You see the city on top, and you see in quite intense focus on the way the ships can come in and out. Because Bergen was, as I said, a city of trade, and a city that was connected to the world, to the global connections, but also with internal trade that had importance for the city and for Norway. Specifically fish, so he is making a barrel for herring. You have a guy who moves lumber, and lumber was maybe the most important material that Norway exported at the time. Almost all the houses in Copenhagen and all the ships that the Danish-Norwegian fleet were built with lumber from Norway. And then the Bergen area was also known for its dairy products. You will see these dairy products much more in a minute. In the exhibition, we introduced Jørgen Garnaas, and we know about Jørgen Garnaas because he produced a series of dolls of people he met on his way. These are 23 centimeters high, they're made in wood, and in these extremely detailed dresses that people, of the people he depicts. So we can see here, for instance, a fisherman who has an attire that is what fishermen used to have in the 18th century of leather, of goat leather, tan leather. And he has a huge halibut fish in his hand that is carved out in the same wood as his hand. So literally, he is kind of the material, he is the fish. The fisherman and the fish is inseparable, which also points to some of the functions of these small dolls. These are not portraits of people, these are portraits of people's trade, what people were working with in the area. So these dolls they're made with papier-mâché heads. These are from the 1750s. There are 33 left. The fact that they have survived this long is quite astonishing in a way. But we have, these are the first kind of pieces we know that Jørgen Garnaas made. And we know that they ended up in the Royal Art Chamber in Copenhagen in the 1760s. And that these was part of the royal collections in Denmark until they modernized the collection in 1824 when they split the old Kunstkammer, which was this kind of wonderkammer, into specialized museums. And then these dolls didn't really fit any of the modern category of art. They weren't sculpture, they weren't really ethnographica, so they were sold on an auction and they ended up in Bergen, where they were just put on an attic in the Bergen Museum until in the early 20th century an art historian found them and realized that these dolls are really, really special and that they have similarities to a sculpture project in Copenhagen, namely Nordmandsdalen. And before this art historian found these dolls, nobody really knew that Nordmandsdalen, this weird project, had any connection to Bergen. They just thought they were made by a kind of not really great artists from Germany, Denmark, Johann Gottfried Grund. So we have, in the exhibition, we show some of these dolls, which are really, really quite remarkable, because they are so detailed. And we don't know a lot about Johann or Grund, about this post writer, because so many of kind of normal laborers in the 18th century didn't leave archival traces. So they don't have a diary, we don't have his intentions, we don't really know much about his craft, because the only material we have is from the royal archives. But we know that he came to Copenhagen in 1764 and was able to go up to the king, who hired him to produce versions of these in ivory that he produced and got a salary for 7 years, between 1864 and 1771. So that's where we have the knowledge of his name and his trade as a wood carver and an ivory carver. In the exhibition, we also put these small dolls beside some of the other craft that was made in Bergen at the time. So while we have a post writer making small dolls, we also have architects and artists who produce art for the king. So the Danish-Norwegian king, they usually traveled to Norway at times to visit the people, to be celebrated by the people and to show their power. And whenever they arrived in a city, the city had made temporary triumphal arches. So this is the drawing of the triumphal arch from Frederik V's father. So this is from the 1730s. And this was produced in Bergen. It's about 6 meters tall. It was made in wood and papier-mâché. And it had the sculptural program that we know from the time. That is something we recognize from the antiquity. So we have big sculptures here made in plaster that have a symbolic character, where all the figures are holding symbols that are recognizable from the antique semiotics, so to speak. And they are so radically different from the sculptures or the small figures that this postman made. But we wanted to kind of point to the fact that we have all these different craftsmen who made stuff at this time. And this is the iconography we kind of know because it fits into larger European aesthetics of art history. During the time that Garnaas made his small dolls, Frederik V was king. And Frederik V was also supposed to come to Bergen. And he came to Oslo first. And like his father, who had this enormous famous travel in 1733 to Norway, he started in Oslo, but he got so drunk that he couldn't move on any further, which is quite indicative of Frederik V as a king. He was king between 20 years and he died quite young of alcoholism in 1766. But he was so drunk that he actually had to return to Copenhagen. So they had started building these big triumphal arches in Bergen. It was never put up because the king never came. So since the king didn't come to Bergen, people had to come to Copenhagen and visit the king. And that happened to Jørgen Garnaas. The postwriter was able to travel to Bergen and come to Copenhagen, the city of the king, in 1764. Here we have Frederik V, a little bust of him, and a little figure of a man holding a letter. I will show him better in a second. Something that is interesting when you work with sculpture in the 18th century is that we talk now today about sculpture standing outside as public art. But in the 18th century, you don't have the concept of public in the same way, because everything that you see outside, where people gather, is really a representational aesthetic that celebrates the king. So arts and artists at this time, if you make something in public, it is part of a propaganda machinery of the monarchy, the absolute monarchy. And Frederik V, partly due to his fact that he was not a very strong king, was extremely efficient, the people around him, to use and instrumentalize art to create an image of power, both through sculpture and painting. For instance, the Swedish artist Pilo was ordered to Copenhagen, and he was commissioned to make at least 64 portraits of the king that was dotted around everywhere. And these portraits are made in the style of the 17th century French king. They were kind of almost copies of Ribot, who made the famous portraits of Louis XIV. And here we see Frederik V, both from the coronation to him as a leader, in armor. And of course, this king was never in war. He was not a strong king at all. So of course, this is not portraits in the sense that we know portraits today. These are idealization of the monarchy. And in fact, probably they don't even show the king himself. As the art historian Charlotte Christensen has argued, by all means, all these portraits of the king probably shows the king's apothecarist, Gottfried Becker, because he might have been a bit prettier than the king, and he might have been more available for artists than the king, since they were quite look-alike, which points to the fact that art at this time has a radically different function. It's part of a political aesthetic. So when art in public that we know in 18th century Denmark has this aesthetics, it is idealized and kind of upholds the king, also in sculptures, both in bust form and in equestrian statues, men on horses in public space. Well, that, on the one hand, is what we can talk about the public. There's also another side of the way, what we now would consider central to the public debate, where people can come with critique. In the absolute monarchy, you're not allowed to critique the king. If you critique the king, you will lose your head. So, but because the absolute monarchy knew that you needed some kind of ventil, something where people could complain, they organized a whole institution that was called the Supplic Institution, where people could write complaint letters to the king directly. So everyone was juridically allowed to write a letter to the king. Specifically in Norway, the law of Norway said that every Norwegian peasant could write a letter to the king. And you had institutions of people who could read and write, if you couldn't read and write yourself, that would write your complaint to the king. So the king received thousands of complaints every year, and as an act of generosity, he invited some of these letter writers to come to Copenhagen to visit him. This was also something they had learned from France, where that was a kind of it looked really good that the king could meet some poor peasants at times. So the supplication institution, where people write letters to the king, is also something that we find in Nordmandsdalen. We find it in one of the ivory figures that Garnaas made for the king, where we see a peasant with his hat in his hand, and his other hand he holds a ladder. In the little ivory figure that is 8 centimeters tall, the arm has fallen off, but in the other mediations of the sculpture, we see that he holds a hand. And in many ways, this is probably how Jørgen Garnaas himself, when he was allowed to go forward for the king, have had that kind of respect for the king, with his hat in his hand and a letter of complaint or of mercy. So we know that Garnaas came to Copenhagen, and we know it because we've also have found in the archives his signature when he got his first salary for producing miniature figures of Norwegian and Sámi in ivory. And in the exhibition we have gathered the ivory figures that remain, almost all of them. There are about 23 that we now know of. And these are really, really small and extremely detailed, and they show different trades as well. You can see here some better images of them. So here we have a Sámi man from the indigenous population in the north. We have some fishermen, postman, the guy who dances, and sea. The English word for loose is escaping me. One who looks for ships. Pilot. And also a lumberjack over there. One of the things that we have known for a long time that these figures exist, but nobody has really tried to find out why would the king commissioned a postman to come to Copenhagen and to produce tiny miniature figures of Norwegian and Sámi laborers in ivory. And ivory is an extremely expensive material at this time. And we have not really understood and known how this postman and wood carver got access to ivory in Bergen in the 1760s. But then we have done a lot of work in the archives and realized that, of course, ivory came to Bergen quite a lot in the 1760s, because they came with the ships from the transatlantic enslavement trade. That when the Danish-Norwegian ships came to Africa, to the Norwegian colonial trade port, they traded weapons and textiles for enslaved bodies and for ivory. And ivory was used as ballast in the ships that went over to the West Indies to get sugar. And when the sugar came to Bergen and to Copenhagen, ivory also entered the city. So ivory was accessible as a material at that time, but it was a very, of course, an extremely expensive material. So Garnaas had access to that, and due to the ivory was the most important material until porcelain replaced it in the court culture. It was a collectible, but it was also something that every king with respect for themselves in the 17th and 18th century knew how to work in ivory. Not to carve it, but to use this kind of loom where you could make quite intricate works out of ivory. So ivory had a special place in the court culture. But how and why would a Norwegian or Danish king be interested in Norwegian peasants? We haven't really had an answer to that yet. But during our research, we have tried to find at least some answers to this. Because in the 18th century, the economy of the Danish-Norwegian absolute monarchy was really, really bad. Denmark-Norway had been in war with Sweden until 1720 and had almost lost all the money. So they needed to find out how to gather economy to keep the absolute monarchy running. In that process, they started an enormous mapping of all the materials and valuables in the realm, specifically in Norway. So in 1743, the Danish state in Copenhagen sent out a questionnaire to all municipalities in Norway to try to map what do people do there, what kind of materials is valuable there, and how can we get a kind of an economic asset out of it. This questionnaire, as most questionnaire where people can write it themselves, of course didn't turn out really good. People wrote every kind of weird things. So the state in Denmark was really, they couldn't use it for anything. They were not very happy. So they started one of the first journals where people could actually write into the state with analysis and ideas for how to change and optimize the economy. And this is a time where the state control over everything written has been so strict that to come with ideas of what doesn't work in the state economy is not something that you have been able to write about before. But that happens in late 1740s. It's kind of an essay competition. And the guy who is set to edit these essays about the economy is Erected, who is the bishop in Bergen. Erected was the bishop in Copenhagen, or a priest in Copenhagen. He got into trouble with some other priest and was sent to Bergen. Bergen, my hometown, is a city where it rains a lot. He was not happy about being in Bergen. He quite hated being in Bergen, but he was really productive in Bergen. He wrote one of the first books about the Norwegian language, and he started editing this journal about economy and the Ram. And also he wrote the first book at that time about the history of Norway's resources. So he did an enormous amount of research when he traveled around to map all the resources in Norway. Where are the landscape? How can we get more asset and money out of it? And in that process, here's some of them. We find in that book, he came out with the first book about Norwegian resources in 1751 and 52. There is one print in that book that has a specific figure of a man who holds his beard. And in this book, when we started reading that book very closely, we realized that Potoppidan's book describes almost all the figures that Garnaas, the post writer, has carved in ivory. Almost all the types that he has carved is directly relatable in this book. And when you were a post writer, in order to leave the city, you had to have permission by the bishop. And the bishop, we know that was maybe one of the most prolific male post writers. We have almost 3,000 letters of him, just his official records that he wrote while in Bergen. And there weren't that many post writers, so we have reason to believe that the two of them, Garnaas, the post writer, and the bishop Potoppidan, must have met. And the fact that when we read his book, it's quite, I think, arguably sound to say that his small ivory figures is a way, kind of a materialization of an economic mapping of Norway's resources. That Potoppidan must have argued that we need some material images of what the book is trying to do. And that the reason why the king in Denmark was interested in commissioning first quite expensive ivory figures and later to make a whole park comes out of a larger project of mapping the economy of the state. And that the whole sculpture park, as well as these small figures, can be seen as a kind of an economic geography of Norway, where sculpture is used as a way to celebrate and to demonstrate the Ram's riches. Here you can see some more of the... and here you can also see a figure who holds his hand around his beard, which is a gesture. I don't know if people in the 18th century did that a lot, but it is kind of such a curious gesture that to see some similarities between this print, even though he is a lumberjack, and this guy holds a dairy, bowl of dairy, that there are at least some not only visual resonance to this history book, but also all the figures that he describes. He describes the lobster fisherman on the coast and how he is so surprised when he arrives and see all these piles of lobster, which to him is so rich and expensive, but people there on the coast, they just eat it because they have it available, and so forth. But the ivory is just not the latest version. These are some other ivory images we have found by Garnaas. Because then this ivory is then used to make a whole sculpture park. We don't really know exactly who made that decision, but Fredrik V is said, despite his fact that he was a king of disputable rumor, to be his idea himself, to make this enormous sculpture park based on these tiny ivory figures. And it was in an old part where they had been dug in gravel, so it was a hole in the park at that time that has then been repurposed to make this amphitheater of sculpture that we see today. And when one arrives at the park, the first thing you see is a couple that dances on the one side and a couple that plays fiddle and drum on the other side. So the whole park is in many ways organized as a large theater of celebratory for the king, with a victory column in the middle. So Nordmandsdalen is located here on the side of the park. The park in itself was made out by the French architect Jardin, who came to Denmark to design and update this castle that was built in the 1720s. And it was the very famous Danish sculptor, Johannes Wiedewelt, who was responsible for the whole sculpture program in the park. Wiedewelt had been in Rome with Johann Joachim Winkelmann. He was going to develop the neoclassicist version in the Danish and Norwegian state, and came with an enormous program for how this park should be visioned in the new neoclassicist aesthetic. This is from the Danish-Norwegian monument that Wiedewelt made in Norwegian marble. And Wiedewelt was furious when Grund, this German-Danish sculptor, who had never really made any large sculptures before, was commissioned to make Nordmandsdalen, this huge amphitheater of 70 sculpture in his park. So he had kind of been making a whole plan of the park. And now this other guy comes because the king wants to make a big park out of small ivory figures of Norwegian peasants. And Grund, we don't really know that he had made any large sculptures before he gets this project. And we don't have a lot of archival materials of him. We have found 2 drawings at the National Gallery of Denmark's archives that show, at least indicate, kind of a way of scaling up these tiny ivory figures. But he was extremely efficient, so he got the task in 1764. Already within the year he had produced 20 sculptures, and by 1771, 55 sculptures had been made. He took the victory column in the middle, he copied that from Wiedewelt. He basically stole the idea of it, which probably was also one of the reasons why Wiedewelt was so furious and wrote all these letters of complaint, why this horrible artist who did not know how to draw and who did not have an aesthetic program at all was allowed to work in his park. So here you have the victory column in the middle. You have the kind of party that is being assembled. And here is where the original are today. They are now moved into Copenhagen city center, where they stand close by because they have been, they're too old to stand outside. But one of the curious things when you visit the park is that you're not really able to meet the sculptures frontal face. They all stand on the edge of these slopes, which means that you can kind of only stand beside them, which means that you, as a visitor, is oriented the same way as the Norwegian and Sámi peasants, which is oriented towards the symbol of the king in the middle, which kind of underscores the fact that this whole big arrangement is, in a way, one big celebratory kind of theater space for the king. So even though this has been described in early art history as a kind of democratic project, where that depicts the people, the whole architectural framing of it isn't really so much about the people, it is really about the king, where the people is instrumentalized as part of a big celebratory installation. And where all the people from Norway and the Sámi area arrive kind of to Copenhagen, bringing the goods that they bring into the realm. They bring the fish, they come with the wood, they come with the dairy products, so forth. In our exhibition, we were not able to bring the 70 sculptures to, and how to bring a park to Norway was difficult, so we had a small installation that kind of pointed a bit to the park, where we could use some of the plaster cast versions that was made when they were recarving all of these sculptures in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. Normally, these plaster casts stand in the Danish Arts Council's office spaces, where they're used more as decorations. We tried at least to give them a bit better context where we can see their function, but that's also one other iteration of how sculpture moves through media. These are the old ones. Also, the curious thing about all the sculptures is that we can see the relationship between the people and the power also inscribed in their attires. There are quite a few bridal couples in the installation, and in some of the brides they typically have what was called the bridal coins as on them, which in a way was what farmers, that was their bank. Like you had silver as jewelry, that was your money, because you didn't have money in the bank before, so you got it in jewelry. And in these jewelry, you can see the monograms of the king. So here you can see the Frederick V, the king face on the side, and also here the monogram of Christian VII, who came after. Which also kind of points to the relationship between the people and the king, where they literally have the king around their neck, so to speak. Today the original sculptures are quite torn down, which is why they recarve them. And of course, when you go to the park today, you could maybe believe that these are 200-300 years old, because they look already so old in a way. But originally the sculptures were painted white in order to emulate marble, because everything was supposed to look like marble, like the rest of the park. But marble was of course expensive, they were made in sandstone, so they were painted white. But when they recarved everyone 20 years ago, they didn't paint them. Because I guess painted sculpture is a bit kitsch today, we don't really see it, they wouldn't look good. But due to the fact that they didn't paint them, today, and because of the weather and rain, they're already deteriorated so much in 20 years that they're starting to lose limbs and hands. So I do understand that the Norwegian historian thought that they were 200 years old. But they are quite expressive, but they are so different from the kind of neoclassicist ideals of the time. They are big, they are quite square, they have huge hands, you can also see that it's a sculpture that hasn't necessarily gone a classical training, but they have a kind of poetic quality to them, each of them. And here we can see the same sculpture that we saw in the wooden doll of the halibut fisher from south of Bergen. Here the original old one and the new carved version. Due to the political changes in the Danish monarchy at the time, the part stopped in the 1770s. For those who know any about Danish history, you would know that there is an interregnum in 1770 to 72, where the King Christian VII, who had psychological and psychic issues, was also, like his father, not a really good king. The king was taken over by his doctor. The doctor became the real king for about 2 years. And he stopped all the production of art of this kind, this like extravagant production of art. So the whole park stopped. Frederick V was dead. And in order to continue this legacy, the Frederick V's wife, Juliane Maria, she tried to regain power, which she managed to when she managed to cut the head of the doctor who was king for 2 years. But in the process, where she didn't have funding to continue the project that was kind of a legacy for her husband, Frederick V, she was instrumental in publicizing a graphic print version of the 55 sculptures that was done at the time of the park. So it was, in a way, you can see it as a prospect of a commercial of how to show the value of this project, but also to get money to continue the project. Because there was only 55 sculptures finished, and they wanted to at least have 70. And what's interesting with this copper etching is that here, a copper etcher mediated the sculpture project once more. This is a copper etcher that worked with the Danish Royal Society of Science and Letters, and he was trained, classically trained. So in his versions of these sculptures, the sculptures are much neater, they're much tighter, they're much prettier, and they're not as kind of sturdy and butch as the sculptures are in itself. So they are quite elegant. They have more and more got the contrapposto, which is the kind of right way to produce the body in sculpture at the time. So these mediations is actually quite different from the ones in the park. But then we know, too, that this was not the last mediation of it. When Juliana Maria regained power in 1772, she was instrumental to establish the first porcelain factory in Denmark-Norway in 1775, the Royal Porcelain Factory that still exists today. And one of the first series of sculptures or objects that they produced was a Nordmandsdalen series, comprising of 55 miniature statues. They're about 18 centimeters tall, of 55 sculptures from the park. And at the exhibition, we managed to gather almost all of the existing versions of them. And here we see them suddenly in color. But the coloration of them is quite astonishing. And it doesn't necessarily look like how Norwegian peasants looked in the 18th century. Here they are colored according to the norms of the Rococo porcelain factory at the time. And one of the reasons is probably that the ones producing these miniature versions in porcelain, they only had this book to look for. Because the porcelain figures are also very neat, they're super delicate. They do not have the sturdy hands of the workers as the sandstone versions. They are super, super delicate. And we also know that when, in the late 19th century, when they moved the factory, they found the old molds for producing these porcelain figures, and they also found a version of this particular book. So they have probably used this book. And since this book doesn't have color, the people who made these porcelain figures, they didn't know how to, which color the Norwegian peasants have. So they have used the palette they had accessible. So Norwegian peasants look quite more funky in the porcelain versions. Here we have the lobster fish. Normally these are exhibited at the Fredensborg Palace in Denmark. And they are quite, they're really quite beautiful and very, very detailed. And it's interesting that when the Royal Porcelain Factory started to produce figurines, which was of course one of the most kind of rich and lavish things to do, every absolute monarchy with respect for themselves wanted to have a porcelain factory, because porcelain took over the kind of role that ivory had in court culture. And this is one of the first examples we have of porcelain figures of the people, except for the big set that the Russian Katarina the Great, also produced a big set of figures of Russian people almost simultaneously. And they might have been inspired by Nordmandsdalen, since one of the artists who worked to make that set was trained in Copenhagen, and what we have seen, we've been looking into the dialogues of letters between them. But I doubt that Norwegian peasants look this good. But it shows one of the enormous, like the other mediations. And these were exhibited on tables in the court, in the palace, like porcelain figures were used to do. And they were produced in dialogue with Flora Danica, the big set of porcelain that depicted Norwegian plants and Danish plants that was produced simultaneously. And a big set of these were also given as a diplomatic gift to the Swedish king at the time. So here we see also another element of what I've called the kind of puppetry of power. So if the big sculpture park is one big kind of theater stage for how the people is instrumentalized to celebrate the king, here we have it kind of miniaturized to make the people as conversation pieces on the table of the court, where you could look up and hold in your hand the fishermen who, in a way, have produced or made sure that the fish that you're eating, where it comes from. So these kind of lavish tables have been set where the laborers have been there as these visual toys, you can see. At the same time, there were also produced a lot of other kind of labor, specifically of mining, which is interesting because in a way point to the fact that porcelain itself is made, or like it depicts the way porcelain is made. The fact that Norway and Denmark could make porcelain was that they had found kaolin on Bornholm, the material that you make porcelain of, and that you had kvartsit and feldspalt that was found in Norway that made it possible to produce proper porcelain. And the glazing of the porcelain, all the blue and the purple, was also made by cobalt that was also found in the Norwegian mines at the time. So in many ways, these are representations not only of of materials, but they're actually made of the same materials that they are mining. So it is a kind of a materialization of it. I'm coming to the close because we need time for wine and questions. One of the things that I have been dealing a lot with is also the presence of indigenous Sámi people in the Valley of the Norsemen. Because that is not really, people haven't understood why Sámi people, the indigenous people in the north, was interesting for the court in the 1750s. And there are 3 Sámi figures part in every iterations, from the wooden dolls to ivory to sandstone and porcelain. And one of my theories is that this relates to the geopolitical discussion between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in the 18th century of sovereignty over the north. So the colonization of the Sámi territories took place over several centuries, but in 1751 was the final time when Denmark, Norway, and Sweden managed to put the border in these areas. And in the years up to that, there was extremely focus on getting access to and also to depict Sámi, both from Swedish and the Norwegian Danish side, because they wanted to ensure that they could use the Sámi as elements to argue that the border should be on the one kingdom side or the other. So the missionary was used as an enormous force of colonization in order to kind of get Sámi on the right side, to kind of nationalize the Sámi, so to speak. And in that process, artists were activated to create the whole kind of aesthetic of the Danish Sámi people at the time. These are some paintings of the court painters, Johannes Rasch and Hans Henrik Egeberg, who was commissioned to make 35 paintings of Sámi people in Copenhagen in 1748 for Frederik V. The painters had never been to the Sámi territories at all, which also is probably why the reindeer looks like deers, kind of like a Rococo rein. They are very elegant. They have not a lot to do with a proper reindeer. And I have the theory that Garnaas, when he made his small sculpture, hadn't visited Sámi territories either, but that he, in Copenhagen, had met these representations in the court culture of the Sámi. But we know it because we know it, for instance, that Garnaas's reindeer, which does not look a lot like a reindeer if you know anything about reindeers, has the visual resemblance to some of the court painters who also did not know how reindeers looked like. These paintings are normally exhibited in the National Gallery in the corner, dark corner where nobody really sees them. But we know that Garnaas's figures have had an impact, like they might have been inspired by court culture paintings coming out of the missionary. But we also know that they have been part of forming an idea of the Sámi later on. So there was a French expedition that came to Bergen in the 1760s, and they were on their way to the north, but it was too bad weather to go up north. So they ended up in Bergen, where they write that they got access to these figurines in ivory of Sámi people. And those figurines that Garnaas had made was then used to create the images of how Sámi people looked like. So Garnaas's figures was used to show how Sámi people looked like in French scientific literature in the 18th century. So in a way, there are all these different kind of mediations where sculpture takes on new meanings. And also one of Garnaas's most popular pieces that he made in several versions is of a man from Finnmark fighting a bear. And that figure was also used to create one of these prints in the French scientific literature about people in the north. Here are also some of the Sámi representations. So to come to a close, Nordmandsdalen has, as I said, been traveling through medium from wood to ivory, sandstone, graphic print, porcelain. And the park in itself has also taken on different meanings, from in a court culture where Frederik V could take his friends and diplomats and visitors, to when the park was opened up from the public in the mid-19th century, in the 1849, when Denmark got a democracy. In the late 19th century, Nordmandsdalen became focus of the kind of a nationalistic movement, and also the Scandinavian movement. And in 1862, the Norwegian Swedish and Danish students had a student party in Nordmandsdalen, where they had 1,500 people for dinner. They had made tables around. They had dressed up the Nordmandsdalen figures, as you can see here in this print. They had made a big kind of pyramid celebratory for the king in the middle, beside the column that they had also decorated. And it was used as another way to celebrate the nation state, not the monarchy, but the national idea of it. And this started a whole trend of kind of understanding Nordmandsdalen as something to do with the nation building and national romanticism and with the people. So some of the idea of this project as a democratic project that really celebrated the people came out in the 19th century. And that is kind of the narrative that has been used later on. We also know that Adolf Tiedemann, one of Norway's most famous national romantic painters, visited Nordmandsdalen on a trip in the 1860s and drew inspiration from them that might have also inspired some of his paintings of Norwegian peasants that was extremely important in the Norwegian nation building and the kind of creation of the Norwegian cultural image. So Nordmandsdalen has been kind of appropriated again and again for different purposes in radically different political projects. And later on in Norway, we have enormous interest in how kind of the people looked like, which kind of has a historical relationship to it. The last kind of iteration of the project happened around 1905, because the porcelain figures were produced between 1770 and 1814, when Denmark-Norway split up. Then the Royal Porcelain Factory stopped producing Nordmandsdalen figures. But then in 1905, when Norway became independent, the first diplomatic gift that Denmark gave to the new Norwegian king was a new version of Nordmandsdalen. So they started reproducing them again in a new version that was then gifted to Norway and that was sold on the market in Copenhagen around 1905. And these porcelain figures are a bit bigger. They were both produced in white and painted. And they have kind of a small, they look a bit different from the old. And that kind of brings us back to our exhibition again, where we have tried in a way to bring all these different mediations of a project together and try to by following the materials, to also open how many different ways sculpture can be used for different political, cultural, and historical purposes. And in that way, try to also break Nordmandsdalen a bit out of the national romantic narrative that it has had as the most Norwegian place in the world, and to say that Norway wasn't really so Norwegian in the 18th century. It was entangled globally. It was connected to the colonies, and Nordmandsdalen is actually one way to both materially and visually point towards those interconnections, to kind of break out of the national way art history has been told and try to create more complex stories of how sculpture has functioned, both in relations of power, but also in relations to how people have taken it back, reused it, and repurposed it for all other ways of telling stories. So I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very, very fascinating and very eloquent tour back to Nordmandsdalen, to Bergen, and to the sort of through all these different embodiments that these sculptures have. That was really great. I'm sure that there are questions. Feel free. Otherwise, I can maybe begin with one. Because I was fascinated by that contrast between Widerveld and the sculptures in Nordmandsdalen, especially because Widerveld, as you said, had been in Rome to study Greek classical sculpture. And so my question would be the aesthetics of these. So we get this story about Garnaas, who's sort of I don't know, it sounds folkloristic in a way. And I wonder, how would that really, how are we to understand the aesthetics of it? Because you bring out the ideology very well.
It's a really good question, and I think it is interesting because when in previous Danish art history, they haven't, like, nobody has really written about Grund because of the aesthetics, because it didn't fit into the image of the time. We haven't really had a language to speak about it. Like, what is this? It's kind of before the idea of ethnography is made. Like, but it, it might look like kind of ethnographic pictures of the people, but it's also before the idea of the people really is there. So of course it's a time when we know that we have almu, the workers, is a concept in a different way. And the aesthetics of them, in part because a lot of them, the big sculptures, they are a bit crooked. They have like this weird, so people have only kind of said that, this is just a horrible artist, like he doesn't know his trade. Until one realized that they're actually based on ivory figures. And when you see the ivory figures, they are almost one-to-one, like an upscale. And the ivory figures, because they're made of material that have a bit of a carving to it. So then suddenly things start to make a bit more sense. So I think when you see them as mediations, as a kind of a reproduction that is like just scaled up from a tiny figure, some of the kind of the aesthetic choices, the fact that the play with some of the fishing material goes out of bounds, because you see that exact same thing in Garnaas. So one of the difficult things to know is to assess like where is the creative interpretation that Grund, the royal carver, did, and like what was his agency in a way, because we don't have all the ivory figures yet, like anymore, and we don't have more than these two drawings. It's the only thing I have been able to find are these. And Wiedewelt might be right that compared to Wiedewelt's drawings, he's not a very good, he definitely, drawing isn't his strongest side. And there's also 6 other drawings by Grund in the archives that doesn't show Nordmandsdalen, that show these weird kind of theater-ish figures. So the aesthetic, like I would argue, or kind of would think at least, that the specific aesthetic of them is very much based on the wood, the ivory figures and their take, which kind of brings it into a totally different tradition of craft, because it comes out of the craft of carving, right? And that kind of miniature, which was popular at the time. And there was a long tradition of using Norwegian wood carvers that was sent to Copenhagen to carve in ivory for the king, which has a different aesthetic than the kind of the antique or the neoclassicist ideal sculpture. That is a bit coarse to it. So I think there is a fascination also in the court culture at the time for something a bit more kind of rough in a way, because there is a quite and then during this time a fascination with, or an interest in, both Norway as a territory but also in the workers as a resource. So in one way they don't really fit into an aesthetic narrative, and all like there are these kind of curious things with them. Many of them, they really look as if they have like different, like the shoes don't, like they are so weird in a way, and idiosyncratic, and some of them are like also have, compared to the kind of Winkelmannian idea of serenity and calmness, like some of these have so different expressions. Some are look away, or they look up, and some are scream or like talking, or so their whole kind of affective register is also so different from Wiedewelt. But unfortunately, we don't know a lot of the intentions behind either Garnaas or Grund, but they do. But I think they are so interesting in themselves that it would be really, really nice to really zoom in on some of the aesthetic, even though it is difficult right now because the big sculptures are so, they have been done so much with. So even the so-called original ones in sandstone from 1760s, they have been reformed and reshaped a lot over the years through different renovation practices. So it is also, like some of them are more than 60% redone in the 1950s, where so where does Grund end and where does all the renovation and conservation begin can also be a bit difficult to certain. And since we have them in so many mediations, there's really certain elements that you can kind of trace.
Thank you. Just follow up the placement of them, and the design of the park itself, the garden. Who did that? Because that looks like something more out of Enlightenment France.
Yeah, it's been often said that it was the Frederick V idea himself, that he drew it. That is probably not likely. We know that Frederick V, like Juliana Maria, had connection to like her family. Oh no, take it another way. There is an example from Britain 50 years before where they have redone an old gravel dig into a kind of amphitheater of sorts with sculptures, with radically different types of sculpture, no relation to the kind of sculptural program, but the refurbishing of a kind of a gravel pit into a kind of a landscape we have an example of, which might have been kind of known in Denmark. I think the one who designed this is the same French engineer who was sent to Copenhagen to redo the network of roads in Denmark. So in the around 1750, right now his name eludes me, but Moltke, the real kind of king, got a French engineer to make all new road system to make the roads more efficient, and he worked also on the road from Fredensborg to Copenhagen, because that road was very slow, and since Fredensborg was made into the main, or one of the main castles at the time, where Frederick V and Juliana Maria wanted to live most of the summertime, they needed a more quick road. And he designed a roundabout, which is still there, there was a roundabout with different stages that looks a bit like this in a miniature, and that happened kind of around the same time. And we haven't been able yet to see if we can find papers in the archives to see whether he was also commissioned to do anything else. But just the roundabout that he made that has two levels at Fredensborg, kind of at that time, makes it quite likely that he was involved in the design of the park. But of course the official story is that Frederick V, the king, did it himself. But that's of course also indicative of the kind of the problem when you deal with workers in a way, that so many of these handicrafters, from the wood carvers to the porcelain makers, the names of the people who actually did the labor is often forgotten because it's been overshadowed by, or the story has been told as something else. Yeah, but I have the name in my head.
Yeah, just a question about this first stage of Royal Danish factory making these figurines, were they at that point circulating outside the palace? Was that something?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because it's so, like, we have looked through the lists, like the burning lists, that still exist. One of the problems is that it's hard to know how many copies were made of these. Now we have, like, some of the figures, we know there's like 3-4 different versions that are often painted radically different. But it's still, like, we still haven't been able to trace how many, like, and how big the production, and what kind of, like, could you buy them? Because they started opening at the late 18th century, the porcelain factory did open up, you could buy things. It wasn't only things produced for the court, but it was also something that circulated outside of the court. And it's difficult because when you read the lists, they say figure, like they burned 150 figures that day. And sometimes they say Norwegian figure. That's an indicative that they might be these, right? But often it just says figure. And we know that they produced also figures of like Athena and kind of Greek statues. Like they had different series of figures. It's really, really difficult to pin down how many, thus also where they circulated. But we know that, for instance, like one set was given to the Swedish king, and he sold it off. I don't think he wanted it. It was perhaps also kind of a bit of a fuck you gift in a way. You just kind of fought. Denmark-Norway got the border where they wanted it, not Sweden. The Sámi figures are also there in the mix. Like so some of it's like now they are spread a bit out in different. We know that the second iteration that was produced in 1905, they were kind of for sale. And then also the porcelain factory produced a series of Danish laborers and workers at that time. So but that's, of course, 150 years later. But it's it's just so hard with those archival traces that even though there is, fantastically enough, a lot of archival material for the porcelain factory, it's still, when you look, when you finally get through to the Gothic handwriting, if you just find like at least Norwegian, it's like, okay, there might be relevant here, but it's not so detailed, so we don't really know. And we don't also really know whether they were made to be part of the Flora set. It's said, and there are some traces where it's suggested. We know that it has been on a table with Flora at a certain time, but if it was, how connected it was or not, it's also, we haven't been able to verify it, in the archives at least. Yeah, the sandstone come from Gotland, the original sandstone. Grund wanted to have a German sandstone, but that was too expensive, so they got from Gotland. But now when they recarved it, they have actually used that part, for some of them, a Polish and part a German sandstone, which supposedly is harder, that should be durable, which is, but I don't know, I think you can argue that they probably should have painted them white, and like they were supposed to do. It would have given a different image of the park right now, because if they had been white, and that's why it's a bit fun for us to, like, we could show the plaster versions, because even though they're plaster and not sandstone, they do give an aesthetic sense, at least that comes a bit closer to how it would have been. And now when they redid the park in the image of they have used. They used this print from the book as the image to reproduce the park. So that was done in 2002. So of course this image, which is kind of an image that is partly a documentation of how it was at the time, but also kind of a commercial for how it could be. So we really don't know the status of this image, whether it is a documentation or a projection. But now at least it become like this is the version, in a way, that at least now was redone to be. But what they didn't do in 2002, when they reopened the park, is the trees. Because you can see here, like these are pine trees. So they were, like every other tree was pine. And the whole park was built by, they planted thousands and thousands of trees. A lot of them came from France, some came from southern Denmark, and we have read somewhere, and I don't know if it's correct, but that this is the first time that Norwegian pine trees was introduced to Denmark. So pine trees isn't natural to Denmark. So apparently they were transported to Denmark to be part of this Valley of the Norsemen, to have that aesthetic of pine tree. So of course when they were painted white, they would stand out between the evergreen in the background. But because pine tree is difficult to hold, and they fall down, and they often get ugly on the bottom. So I'm talking to the one who was responsible for the redoing. So they had these different, and we also know that the other trees became so big, so they cut them down as well. but I think some of the sculpture, this sculpture here, which depicts, I think that is to depict a guy who takes snus. I don't know what snus is in English, but it's
it's not actually really nice.
Yeah, you know, like kind of tobacco thing that you.
Yeah, it's
and it's really kind of curious figure because he also has herring with his feet, like a pile of herring, and then he stands with like a pouch and he is about to take a piece of snus. That figure was supposed to, like, that had been there, but apparently in a storm in the 1850s, a tree has fallen and broken it, destroyed it. So it was replaced with a Faroese figure that they found in a lapidarium in Fredensborg that also Grund made, because he made these 10 figures of Faroese people on his own account. And when Grund died, he was working on a series of Icelandic figures that was also supposed to be put up. But then Julian Marie had died, and after she died, she was like the widow of Frederick V, who was responsible for the economy. Nobody wanted to pay for them. So when Julian Marie died, he had finished 4 Icelandic figures. It was supposed to be the third row of this side, you can imagine. But they were never put up, and nobody wanted to buy them. And Grund made it. We have found this commercial he put in a newspaper in 1800 saying, "I have these 4 sculptures, very cheap Icelandic people, like come," and nobody bought them. So when he died, his son made another advertisement and like, "Please, can somebody," like he wrote a letter to the state and asked the state if they wanted to get those 4 Icelandic figures that was made for this part, but they said no, and now they're gone. But so if anyone finds some Icelandic sandstone figures who looks a bit weird, please give us a call. Very interested in where they have ended up.